Hello everyone, and welcome to our review for our third test in music appreciation. I'm Floyd Richmond, your teacher, and we're going to be looking at music in the classical, romantic, and modernistic periods. But first, according to one study, people don't notice when you replace any given word with the name of a musical instrument, but I don't believe that to be true. What is classical composer Ludwig van Beethoven's favorite fruit? Banana. What is romantic opera composer Giuseppe Verdi's favorite way to get around the airport? La Travelator. What do fish and music have in common? Scales. What do a fish fillet and Arnold Schoenberg have in common? No scales. Modernistic composer Arnold Schoenberg walks into a bar. He says, "I'll have a gin, please, but no tonic." I went to bed last night with the music playing. I got a sound sleep. So for a quick explanation of a couple of those jokes, Giuseppe Verdi wrote an opera called La Traviata. La Traviata, translated loosely, means the fallen woman, someone who has traveled far from the path. The plot of La Traviata is basically this. Violetta Valerie is a woman of the court who has many boyfriends. She falls in love with Alfredo, not the sauce, and they move to the country, and she abandons her old way of life. Her reputation, however, still persists, and Alfredo's father comes and tries to talk her out of the relationship. She reluctantly agrees, they separate, and then the rest of the opera is about them trying to reconnect. They finally do reconnect at the very end, but Valerie is ill and dies in his arms. About the Arnold Schoenberg joke, Arnold Schoenberg is best known for his abandonment of tonality and traditional forms of harmony in music. He forbade the use of specific scales in his music, hence the joke, "I'll have a gin, but no tonic, no scale." But seriously, I'd like to begin with a little bit of a review from some of our previous work. Here on the screen is a list of medieval composers. Now, of these composers, you will notice that we have studied 2 of these 10 in some detail, Hildegard of Bingen and Michaud, and we've just simply not had enough time to do the remainder of the medieval composers. Now, there is good news. You actually have an assignment coming up where you need to write a paper, and I'm going to suggest that you might examine this list. You don't have to write on a composer. You can write on anything in this course, but this is one direction that you might want to choose. Here's a list of Renaissance composers from our previous studies, and again, you'll notice that we have really looked at just a few of these composers: John Dunstable, Josquin des Prez, and Thomas Wilkes. Here you will find a list of Baroque composers, Bach, Vivaldi, and Handel in particular, and lightly looked at Purcell and Pachelbel. Now, this is getting to today's topic, and in the field of classical music, we are looking mostly at the music of Franz Joseph Haydn, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, and Ludwig van Beethoven. There are so many other composers from the classical period that could use attention. I'd love for any of you to select any of these as your topic. The Romantic composers list is much longer, and you'll notice that we have been looking at these in bold in greater detail. But even so, there's a great list of composers that we just have not had time to listen to. If you're interested in Fanny Mendelssohn or Clara Schumann, I highly recommend both of those as female composers. The modernistic composers have included Igor Stravinsky, Benjamin Britten, whose Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra we heard earlier in the semester, George Gershwin, and Arnold Schoenberg. Once again, there's a great collection of composers on this list. Leonard Bernstein, who is listed here, is the composer of West Side Story, which has recently had a revival. John Williams is renowned for his incredible film music, especially in the Star Wars series. Okay, so here are some of the questions that you will have on the test. Match the following forms or types of music to their definitions. Operatic overture, an introductory instrumental piece opening an opera and often featuring many of the themes to be used later in the program. It's been a feature of opera since its beginning in the early 1600s. Rondo, large song form with a recurring theme, A, B, A, C, A, B, A. The rondo was used in earlier periods, but it was especially prominent during the classical and following periods. Theme and variation is a large song form with a single melody which is repeated with rhythmic, melodic, harmonic, textural, and other variations. It was used in earlier periods, but again, it was especially prominent during the classical and following periods. The sonata is a large song form with an exposition, meaning it has two themes, A and a B, a development, which is a fantasy on those two themes, and a recapitulation, meaning that it returns to the A and B themes. A symphony is a piece of music typically with four movements. Movement 1 is normally fast, allegro, and in sonata form. Movement 2 is normally slow, andante, with various forms. Movement 3 is often a dance in triple meter. Movement 4 is normally fast and in sonata form. Instrumentation is typically for a full orchestra. When this form is written for piano, it is known as a piano sonata. When it's written for a string quartet, it is a string quartet. The word symphony is often used to describe the orchestra that plays a symphony. A piano sonata is a song for piano, usually in four movements, which follows the form of the symphony, and we've already talked about those. A string quartet is an ensemble consisting of two violins, viola, and cello. The repertoire often consists of four movements which follow the form of the symphony. Mozart and Haydn wrote extensively for this ensemble, but Haydn is the father of the string quartet. Chamber ensemble, an ensemble of only a few players, often on related instruments. The following ensembles have become standards and major composers have written for them. The brass quintet consists of two trumpets, horn, trombone, and tuba. The woodwind quintet consists of flute, oboe, clarinet, horn, and bassoon. The string quartet consists of two violins, viola, and cello. The string orchestra is an ensemble consisting of multiple players on the following parts: violin 1, violin 2, viola, cello, string bass. An orchestra is an ensemble consisting of a string orchestra with brass, woodwind, and percussion. The orchestra increased consistently in size in every era until the Modernistic period. A minuet is a slow, stately dance in triple meter. It was common in the classical period and often used as the third movement of a symphony. The scherzo is a vigorous and quick dance in triple meter, again often used as the third movement of a symphony. An etude is a relatively short study piece for students, usually focusing on a single performance technique, but often, especially by Chopin, used as a vehicle for expressive composition. A nocturne is a relatively short night piece which is usually slow and reflective. Chopin wrote a good number of piano nocturnes, but the term is used for other instruments as well. An art song is a song usually for voice and piano. It was used throughout all musical periods, but especially in the Romantic era. A tone poem is a musical composition for orchestra and instrumental ensemble which tells a story or communicates a non-musical idea. Its form is most often not that of a sonata or symphony, as those would restrict the storytelling. So, match the following terms with their definitions. Absolute music is music which is written for the sake of the music itself, that is to say, the notes and the sounds. It does not contain programs or non-musical ideas. This was common in the music of Bach, Mozart, Haydn, and Brahms, as exemplified by their naming of many of their works. Bach's Fugue in G minor, Mozart's Symphony No. 40, Haydn's Symphony No. 94, Brahms' Symphony No. 1, etc. Program music is a composition which tells a story or communicates a non-musical idea. This was common in much of the Romantic and Impressionistic periods, with the naming of many pieces focusing on non-musical ideas or programs. Debussy's La Mer, for example, meaning the sea. Atonal. Atonal music is music which does not use a key or scale for its melodies or harmonies. It attempts to avoid establishing an emphasis on a tone or a key center, avoiding the tonality of the previous centuries of music. It was a central feature of much early modernistic music, and it was especially endorsed by composers such as Arnold Schoenberg and his students. Asymmetric meter is music with an uneven beat or irregular pulse. Frequent examples include music in 5/8 or 7/8. It was often used in modernist music. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Uneven beat. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Through composed music is music whose melodies have little or no repetition. Though it was used in the earliest musical compositions and occasionally in periods that follow, it experienced some additional use in the modernist period. Cadenza. a passage featuring a soloist alone, usually on virtuosic content. It is especially used in classical and romantic concertos. It sounds improvisatory, meaning made up, but they are often notated. A countermelody is a secondary melody played contrapuntally with another, especially in Baroque polyphonic music, but in other music also. An obbligato melody is often a secondary melody played contrapuntally with another to enhance the original. The addition of an obbligato melody was an often used technique for creating variations on a theme in classical music. In some other contexts, the obbligato melody is optional, but it is required in the classical theme and variation pieces. Nationalism is a movement in the Romantic period to create music celebrating the geographic and political origin of the composer and/or music, and to build pride among the natives of those areas. Impressionism is a short musical period between the Romantic and Modernistic movements which featured the works especially of French composers such as Debussy and Ravel. The music ran parallel to the Impressionistic period in French art, and in music the focus was on dissonant but light programmatic music. Match the following sonata-related terms with their definitions. An exposition is the first major section of a classical sonata consisting of two themes, A and B, in different keys. The development is the fantasy section of a classical sonata where the development of A and B themes from the exposition occur. Recapitulation: the repetition of the major themes, A and B, in a classical sonata, this time in the key of the piece, drawing the composition to a close. A coda is an ending added to a piece of music to draw the piece to a close. It features repeated harmonic cadences emphasizing the key of the piece. A sonata often begins with an introduction, which is simply served to get the attention of the listener and to lead into the exposition. Any of these sections may have transitional material between them, and that would be especially true if the key is changing between or within the sections. Melody in the classical period was stepwise, had similar leaps to previous eras, had evenly metered phrases, it was homophonic, and it used mostly major and minor keys. Melodies in the Romantic era had a wider range. They used extreme ranges more often. They used less even phrases, and while still major and minor, the melodies were more chromatic. In the Modernistic and Contemporary period, the music was less stepwise. In other words, it leaped around much more. It was much more chromatic, and it was much less based on the scale, often atonal. If we look at rhythm in these three periods, we see that in the classical era, music was strongly metered, not driving. It used evenly spaced phrases every 4 to 8 measures, with room to breathe. In the Romantic era, the rhythm was still strongly metrical. It used less even phrases and greater use of extreme tempos. In the 20th century, there was an increasing use of asymmetric meter, and there were frequent time signature changes. Let's look at harmony in our three periods. In the classical period, music was mostly major and minor. In the Romantic period, mostly major and minor, but with more chromatic notes. There were greater dissonances and delayed resolutions. In the Contemporary or Modernistic period, harmonies were experimental. There were a atonal system of compositions that abolished tonality altogether, but some tonality did persist. If we look at texture in the Classical, Romantic, and Contemporary periods, we find that in the Classical period, music was mostly homophonic. In the Romantic period, there were thicker textures, but music was still mostly homophonic. In the Modernistic period, we found that music used lighter textures. It had stronger dissonances, but they were often treated lightly, and music was still mostly homophonic. When it comes to form in the classical period, large forms really came of age during this period. The rondo and theme and variations led to the development of the sonata. The sonata led to the development of the symphonies. Minuets and scherzos were small forms that were incorporated into the symphony. In the Romantic period, we saw the expansion of form in that art songs became much more emphasized, tone poems became much more emphasized, program music as opposed to absolute music of the classical period became much more emphasized. There were larger musical forms, meaning that all of the existing forms were made longer and larger, and there were longer development sections. There were uneven phrases, and music was less predictable. In the 20th century, there was more freedom in all forms. Some strict composing processes, especially 12-tone composition, limited what you could do with these things, but in most cases there was more liberty. There was a use of more through composed music in the 20th century as well. Less repetition and more contrast. Expression during the classical period saw vocal and instrumental ensembles become larger. Mozart began to use the clarinets. Beethoven began to use the timpani. Additional instruments were added to the orchestra. For the first time, dynamics, including graduated dynamics, that would be crescendos and decrescendos, were added to the music. It's hard to believe that it took us until 1750 to add dynamics to our music. Tempo markings were used by Beethoven in the late classical period, and music, as we said before, was much more absolute, meaning that it focused on the music itself and not on a particular program for its meaning. In the Romantic period, there were both vocal and instrumental music, but there was a bigger shift toward instrumental music. There were bigger orchestras, there were more brass, valves were developed during the Romantic period, enabling the brass to play a chromatic scale more freely, and the piano had been developed to its full size and volume as well. There were greater extremes of emotion and dynamics and tempos in Romantic music as well. Romantic music saw a shift of focus to program music as opposed to absolute music of the classical period. In the Modernistic period, there was both vocal and instrumental music, but ensembles were generally smaller. There were some lighter expressions, there were some strong dissonances, there were still some extremes in emotions and themes. Okay, let's move to our next section. Here we will see that we're going to have some matching on the test, and in this particular section you will notice, and this is not a complete list of all the people from your listening, but all of the composers from your listening will be included on this list. So I'll be asking you to match the following composers with the time period in which they composed. So Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven were the classical composers that I would want you to know. The ones in bold here are the Romantic composers that I would want you to know. Frédéric Chopin and Franz Liszt, best known for composing dramatic piano works. Richard Wagner and Giuseppe Verdi are best known for their opera compositions. Richard Wagner for his composition of German opera, Giuseppe Verdi for his composition of Italian opera. Ludwig van Beethoven is listed as a Romantic composer because he bridged the gap between the classical and the Romantic periods. Many people consider Beethoven's symphonies, 1st, 2nd, 4th, 7th, and 8th, to be very strongly classical in nature, but they consider the 3rd, 5th, and 9th symphonies to be highly Romantic. The rest of the composers on this list are all instrumental composers of note, except for Robert Schumann and Franz Schubert. Schumann and Schubert composed art songs. Debussy is on the right-hand side of this list near the bottom. He is a notable composer as well, as was Ravel, but we only have so much time in this class. Modernistic composers of whom you should be aware would be Stravinsky, Benjamin Britten, George Gershwin, and Arnold Schoenberg. Igor Stravinsky wrote the Firebird Suite, Benjamin Britten wrote The Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra, George Gershwin wrote Rhapsody in Blue, and Arnold Schoenberg wrote Verklärte Nacht. On this page, you will see that I'm asking you to match specific forms with the time periods in which they originated or with which they are most associated. And you will find that I have made comments in the definition sections on each of those forms, and so by doing that you should be able to complete this matching test. I've given you a couple of examples here. The sonata is a long form of great significance in the development of the symphony and the piano sonata, and it was developed during the classical period and continued into the subsequent periods. The rondo is a long form with recurring A sections, A, B, A, C, A, B, A, for example. It was most used in the classical period, but it originated in earlier and continued into subsequent periods. There will be some questions where I ask you for some essay detail, so let's just run over those real quickly. Briefly describe the rondo. The rondo is a long form with a recurring A section and a number of contrasting sections, for example, A, B, A, C, A, B, A. Abacaba is sometimes called. Describe theme and variation in detail. Notice if you have the words in detail in a question, I'm expecting more than the short definition that you may have given earlier. A theme is another word for a melody. A variation is an alteration to the theme, usually melodically, rhythmically, or harmonically. The theme and variation technique has been used throughout musical history, but in the classical period, it became especially common to create compositions using a single theme, which was then followed by multiple variations. The development of the variation process contributed to longer forms, such as the classical sonata. Describe the classical sonata in detail. A long form organized as follows: introduction, which is optional; exposition, which includes two themes, an A theme and a B theme in different keys; the development, which is a fantasy on those two themes; the recapitulation, which is the restatement of the A and the B theme, but this time in the original keys; and the coda. The introduction and coda were optional, and any section of the sonata could have transitional or bridge-like materials between them. However, this was especially common if an upcoming section was to be in a new key. The exposition consisted of two primary themes, A and B, with the first usually in the tonic key, and the second usually in the dominant key. For minor sonatas, A was often in the tonic key, and B was often in the relative major key. Various forms of repetition were used in the exposition. In other words, you could have A-B and move on to the development. You could have A-A-B-B and move on to the development. And then the other forms that you see here, A-A-B, A-B-B, A-B-A-B, and so on. The A-B and the A-B-A-B are the most common among that list. The development of a sonata consisted of an imaginative and creative fantasy section, typically using materials from both the A and B themes. The materials were often fragmented and or combined, and often they were performed in or transposed to or modulated to new keys. The recapitulation uses the same A theme and B theme as the exposition, with the frequent exception that for major sonatas, the B theme was often in the tonic key. The coda was typically a section written to bring the piece to a convincing ending. Okay, this is your listening list. The Mozart Sonata in C starts ta ta ti ta ta da da, and that's the A theme. The Mozart Symphony in 40, beat-a-dum, 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 pum, beat-a-dum, pa-da-dum, pa-da-da, beat-a-dum, 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 pum, beat-a-dum, pa-da-dum, pa-da-da. Okay, there you go. The Haydn Symphony number 94, pum, 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 pa. Sounds a little bit like Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, but it's not. Oh, Mozart's Eine kleine Nachtmusik, Movement 3. So, do, re, mi, fa. Bum, be-da-da-dee-dee-dum. There you go. The Beethoven String Quartet number 4 is one that I'm not going to be able to sing for you, but you can click on the links in your study guide and you'll be able to listen to them. The Mozart opera that I've asked you to watch an excerpt from is Don Giovanni, the opening scene from Act 1. Don Giovanni is a Don Juan character. In this scene, he's not a gentleman. He has his way with the daughter and then murders her father. Now, you don't see this in the scene. You can look it up on YouTube if you like. But at the end of the opera, the father returns as a statue who comes to life and drags Don Giovanni down to, well, judgment is the best word I can say there. Don Giovanni is a masterwork by Mozart, and even though the subject matter may be a little bit less than appealing, the music is absolutely incredible. In this particular scene, Don Giovanni encounters resistance and then surrender from one of his lady conquests. So I've also asked you to listen to a little bit of Mozart's Piano Concerto Movement Number 1. We talked about concerto originally in the Baroque period, but the piano concerto was something that Mozart and Haydn did very well. You'll find excellent piano concertos written by both of these composers, and they are definitely worth hearing. The Beethoven Pathetique Piano Sonata is one that you will immediately recognize. It has the emotional content of the Romantic period, but it is a traditional sonata. Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, Movement 1, pa-da-da-pa, pa-da-pa-pa, sounds like fate knocking on the door. Movement 2 is slow, as is typical of the second movement of any symphony. Movement 3 is a scherzo, a light, vigorous dance. Movement 4 is also a traditional sonata form with several unexpected extensions in the exposition and coda. The coda especially references themes from Movement 1. It ends on an uplifting note. The Franz Schubert Erlkönig, or the Elf King, is the story of a dying boy riding on horseback with his father. The content is emotionally charged. The rhythms, melodies, and harmonies are rich. There is chromatic harmony, including, and this will only mean something to trained musicians, German augmented sixth chords and Neapolitan sixth chords, but suffice it to say for our purposes, it contains rich chromatic harmony. Robert Schumann's Estrella from Carnival is a piano piece. It's a musical depiction of the composer's fiancée. It's written in ABA form. Robert Schumann's Reconnaissance from Carnival is a piano piece. It's written in ABA form. It's a musical depiction of a reunion at a carnival. Frédéric Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major is a piano piece. It's AABABA form. It's a musical depiction of a peaceful night scene, as all nocturnes are. Frédéric Chopin's Etude in C minor is known as his Revolutionary Etude. It's a work for piano, and it depicts the Polish military loss to the Russians. It is fast-paced and has strong descending left-hand lines. Chopin's piano virtuosity is shown in this etude, and it is one of his most performed pieces. Franz Liszt was alive at the time of Chopin. He and Chopin knew each other. Occasionally they would go to the same parties. They occasionally would play one after the other on concerts or at parties, and Liszt was a very heavy-handed composer, also an incredible virtuoso. His Transcendental Etude No. 10 in F minor is a virtuoso piece that challenges even the most accomplished pianist. The piece is through composed. Felix Mendelssohn is very well known for his violin concerto in E minor. And this sonata has a cadenza, meaning that the soloist gets to show off their dazzling technique. Hector Berlioz wrote Symphonie Fantastique. It's for orchestra, and it's a musical depiction of a condemned person's walk to the scaffold. Bedřich Smetana wrote the Moldau. The Moldau is a tone poem for orchestra, and it describes a river in Czechoslovakia and its path from its source to the next river. Along the way, there are country scenes, including a hunt, a country wedding, and rapids. Antonin Dvorak's Symphony No. 9 is known as the New World Symphony, and the second movement, the Largo, has a beautifully enchanting theme. Pa-da-da, pa-da-da, pa-da-da-da-da. It is not music from the New World. It is music that captures the spirit of the New World. Dvorak lived in America for a year or two. Dvorak's New World Symphony, Movement 4, sounds like the Jaws theme in its beginning and is very bold in its proclamation afterward. Pa-da-da-da-da-da, pa-pum-pa-pa-pa. It's in a minor key. Johannes Brahms. So Johannes Brahms is an interesting composer. He lived in the Romantic period, but his music sounds very classical in nature. In fact, the description of this piece says a quiet, almost classical theme in triple meter. So Symphony No. 3 in F, Movement 3. Of course, triple meter would be expected for the third movement. Giuseppe Verdi's Rigoletta, La Donna Immobile is a song about women supposedly being fickle, sung by Rigoletto, the primary character. It's a tenor solo. Puccini has written for us Rodolfo meets Mimi from La Bohème. La Bohème translates basically the Bohemian. That's a term that generally means someone who lives life without boundaries. And in this particular opera, Rodolfo and Mimi experience the disastrous consequences of living life without boundaries. This, however, is a tender love song from when Rodolfo meets Mimi. Richard Wagner wrote Da Valkyrie, Act 1, Conclusion. This is an opera about magical gold, love between mortals and gods, and the tragic consequences. Wagner was particularly known for writing very large orchestral accompaniments. Peter Tchaikovsky wrote a tone poem, Romeo and Juliet, the Fantasy Overture, for orchestra. It describes Shakespeare's tragedy, Romeo and Juliet. As you might expect, there's a lot of reflective melancholy found in this piece. So other pieces from the Romantic period will include Johannes Brahms' Symphony No. 1, Peter Tchaikovsky's Symphony No. 5, Claude Debussy's Prelude on the Afternoon of a Faun, George Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue, Igor Stravinsky's Firebird Suite, and Arnold Schoenberg's Verklärte Nacht. Schoenberg didn't immediately start writing atonal music. He initially was quite an accomplished tonal composer, and this particular song is in D major, B minor. It is not 12-tone. It has a strong key center, and so this is probably one of the more approachable Schoenberg pieces that you could hear. That's going to conclude our review for the test. You should be ready to roll. But first, I'm told that a note was recently discovered from a pianist to his wife. It reads, "Gone Chopin, have Lizst, Bach in a minuet." That joke was so funny, I don't know if I can handle it. What do you say to the musician playing the triangle in the orchestra? Thank you for every ting. Well, you should be ready for the test. I'll see you in class.